Post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD, happens when some traumatic memory, such as war or sexual assault, causes current mental or physical distress. The DSM-5, that was published in 2013, categorizes PTSD as a trauma and stressor disorder. In order to be diagnosed with PTSD, the symptoms need to be present or last over a month. Psychological symptoms include reliving the trauma in nightmares, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, etc. And behavioral symptoms manifest themselves through avoiding certain situations that remind you of the trauma, you're easily startled, or you're constantly watching for your surroundings. This understanding of PTSD hasn't always been this way. So throughout this presentation, I would like to track the evolution of PTSD from 5 historical eras, dating back from 2000 BC to present day. The earliest symptoms of PTSD can be found in a famous Mesopotamian tale in 2000 BC called the Epic of Gilgamesh. In this story, the king Gilgamesh befriends a wild man named Enkidu. Both Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the bull of heaven, and this upsets the gods, so they decide to kill Enkidu. Gilgamesh witnesses the brutal killing of his friend, and he falls into deep despair and begins re-experiencing the death multiple times in his sleep and in daily activities. Some historians have even found PTSD symptoms in biblical passages such as Deuteronomy 20:1-9 that explain how army generals sent men home who were quote-unquote fearful or faint of heart, in danger that their mentality would spread to other warriors. The topics of the effects of war and battle became a popular topic within famous ancient literature writers such as Hippocrates, Descartes, and even Shakespeare. But the Industrial Revolution gave rise to the very first recorded medical cases of PTSD due to man-made disasters. In this time of railway disasters, individuals reported injuries after crashes, but with no apparent physical injuries. This puzzled the public as well as physicians. The leading German neurologists at the time came up with a theory that the symptoms such as anxiety, irritability, headaches, and numbness were all due to a physical damage to the spine of the brain. Therefore, the term was coined, railway spine. But other scholars believed and debated that the symptoms were due to a kind of hysteria. These two opposing views maintained until World War I. During World War I, psychiatric casualties were being reported in stellar numbers never seen before. In February of 1915, the term shell-shocked was coined by Charles Meyer in an article in The Lancet to describe 3 soldiers suffering from the loss of memory, vision, smell, and taste. He believed their soldiers were physically in shock from seeing and hearing bombs, and the recorded physical symptoms were similar to the quote-unquote soldier's heart, the term used for PTSD during the Civil War, that included heart palpitations and difficulty breathing. Physical symptoms included tremors, paralysis, contractions, limping, or fixed postures, so the application of electrical current was often believed to remove these symptoms. The popular and common assumption in America was that shell shock was curable, and if the rough environments of war triggered these diseases, then calm and peaceful environments was the cure. Newspapers began advertising for treatments such as music and faith in Christ would help individuals overcome shell shock, but the number one form of recovery was support from a soldier's family, putting strain on the women of the house to create a loving and peaceful environment where the soldier could recover. Psychologists were convinced that the treatment for these symptoms should be in frontline hospitals and that evacuation would only create a more chronic prognosis. They also believed that this issue was temporary and most soldiers treated for shell shock were sent back to battle. When World War I ended, America entered a time of peace, and because shell shock was believed not only to be a temporary condition, but also induced by stressful environments, men that were plagued with PTSD were unable to receive treatment. When World War II began, it seemed as if all that was learned was lost, and the number of psychiatric casualties increased. The term shell shock was replaced with the term war neurosis, which reflected the idea that this condition was a personality type deficiency. The term war neurosis was thought to be a sign of weakness and that men were unable to handle war. Therapies for PTSD remained the same, and doctors still used electric convulsive therapy, psychosurgery, until British psychologist William Sargant became famous for treating patients of war neurosis with insulin-induced comas. Influenced by Freud, he believed that if patients entered sleep-like states, they would be well rested not only enough to return to battle, but to work through their trauma in their dreams. These insulin-induced comas would last for days, and soldiers would only be awoken 1 hour a day to eat food. The treatments during World War II reflected the understanding of PTSD as a weakness and personality flaw. After the war ended in 1952, the DSM-1 was published and PTSD was referred to as gross stress reaction. It was considered a personality disorder due to the severe physical demands and extreme emotional stress in combat or civilian catastrophe. In 1968, the DSM removed gross stress reaction and instead added adjustment reaction to adult life. It was described as an acute reaction to overwhelming environmental stress. Neither the DSM-1 nor DSM-2 described or listed the disorder. The removal of gross stress reaction once again reflected the understanding of the times that this disorder was linked to war, and because the country was no longer experiencing war, the disorder was removed. All of this changed during the Vietnam War. Each battalion was given their own medical personnel that was psychologically trained to help soldiers. During the beginning of the war, these strategies seemed to help stop psychological casualties, and very little were recorded. But as the war continued, this changed. When veterans returned home, they were received with hostility, and the lack of social support seemed to not only increase psychological casualties, but as well as stigma. Research shows that as many as 40% of veterans were suffering from PTSD symptoms. All the attention coming from war, especially from advocates, helped begin many studies of the effects and symptoms of this quote-unquote veterans readjustment disease. PTSD was finally considered a mental health disorder 5 years after the Vietnam War in 1980, when the DSM-3 was published. In the DSM-3, the main argument was what was trauma and what should be considered trauma. Any stress that is usually well tolerated by other members of the cultural group was their definition of trauma. This definition has undergone many changes since its original diagnosis, from the appearance of symptoms such as anger, withdrawal, and even self-destructive behavior, and many more. There have been a large number of changes in the diagnosing of PTSD today. Perhaps the biggest is the removal from the anxiety disorders category. Numerous research has shown that PTSD embodies multiple emotions: guilt, shame, anger, outside of the fear spectrum. PTSD should not be included in anxiety disorders. Another addition to the diagnosing of trauma is the understanding that not all stressful events involve trauma. This change came specifically after the vague definition of trauma in the DSM-4. By that definition, everybody who had witnessed 9/11 could have been diagnosed with a traumatic experience. The DSM-5 requires actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence as trauma. This excludes stressors such as divorce or job loss. Wakening during a surgery could be considered a medically based trauma, but cases such as terminal cancer no longer qualifies as trauma. Another major change has been the DSM-5's removal of the need of intense fear, hopelessness, or helplessness in criteria for diagnosis. We have understood that conflating the subjective experience of trauma with objective exposure is a serious conceptual error. This has been very important in the advancement of developing an objective definition of trauma. Scientists are still unaware, however, the role biology plays in the development of PTSD. There are many hypotheses, but no general consensus. A therapy for patients with PTSD was created by a psychologist named Francine Charpiot. In 1987, he began the first cycle of therapy with demonstrated neurobiological effects. This therapy is called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, in which patients respond to bilateral sensory stimulation while maintaining specific components of a targeted memory, related emotions, and bodily sensations in mind. This therapy has been proven effective for the last 3 decades, and many neurologists are still trying to comprehend why. One hypothesis is that the working memory is being overloaded, and therefore it is making it more available to manipulate memories. The theory is that the central executive system is retrieving emotionally charged memories, while the visual spatial sketchpad is working on maintaining attention with finger movements. This taxes the working memory and causes the emotionally linked traumatic memory to lose its charge. Another popular therapy for modern-day PTSD is exposure therapy, in which a trained psychologist presents the patient gradually to the traumatic event and helps them work through mental states and control their emotions. With the advancement of technology, this therapy is often combined with virtual reality for many veterans, where they are in control of their environment while a psychologist is present. After the exposure, they are able to speak with their psychologist on their feelings throughout the treatment. Antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications are often prescribed to PTSD patients and is a reflection of our current understanding of the neurobiological changes that accompany mental disorders. The reason that PTSD is often thought to be war-related is due to its long history and studies related to war, but PTSD is not only for war veterans. Thanks to modern-day research, we have come to recognize that PTSD can include a multiple of causes. Individuals who are survivors of natural disasters, kidnappings, witness brutal murders can have PTSD, and even people like me who are survivors of sexual assault live with PTSD as well.